In 850 AD, a group of Chinese alchemists were trying to make a potion that would grant eternal life. They failed. But what they accidentally created instead killed more human beings than any other invention in the history of civilization. They were not trying to make a weapon. They were not trying to change warfare. They were not trying to reshape the political map of the entire world. They were looking for immortality, and what they found was gunpowder. That single accident in a Chinese laboratory did not just change how wars were fought. It ended entire empires, made others possible, and drew the borders of the modern world we live in today. The knight in shining armor, made obsolete overnight. The castle wall, reduced to rubble in minutes. The age of kings ruling by physical strength, finished. And it all started with 3 ordinary ingredients that anyone could find in their own backyard. This is the story of gunpowder. And it begins not on a battlefield, but in a kitchen. The Tang Dynasty in 9th century China was one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. Chang'an, the capital, was home to over 1 million people at a time when London barely had 10,000. Chinese scholars had already developed paper, printing, and the compass. The empire's philosophers, poets, and mathematicians were centuries ahead of their counterparts in Europe. And yet, despite all of that sophistication, the most powerful people in the empire were still desperately afraid of death. The emperor and his court had spent decades funding a group of Taoist alchemists whose single mission was to find the Elixir of Immortality. They experimented with hundreds of compounds, mixing metals, minerals, and plants in every conceivable combination, searching for the formula that would allow a human being to live forever. One day, working with a mixture that contained saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, one of those alchemists made an error. The proportions were wrong. The heat was too high. And the mixture did something none of them had ever seen before. It exploded. The laboratory caught fire. Several alchemists were reportedly burned. The experiment was, by every measure, a disaster. But someone in that room understood that what they had just witnessed was not a failure. It was something else entirely. The Chinese called it Hui Yao, fire medicine. Within decades, the military implications were obvious to everyone. By the 10th century, the Song dynasty was using early gunpowder weapons in warfare. Fire arrows. Primitive bombs packed into clay containers and hurled at enemy formations. Flamethrowers built on the backs of horses. None of these weapons were particularly accurate. None of them were reliable. But they did something no previous weapon had ever done. They created fear on a scale that arrows and swords simply could not match. The sound alone, the sudden, violent crack of an explosion in the middle of a battlefield, was unlike anything soldiers had ever experienced. Horses panicked. Formations broke. Men who had stood their ground against every conventional weapon turned and ran. The Chinese had not found immortality. They had found something far more powerful. Understanding why gunpowder works requires understanding what it actually is. Gunpowder, also known as black powder, is a mixture of 3 ingredients. Saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate. Charcoal. And sulfur. Each ingredient does a specific job. Saltpeter is the oxidizer. It provides the oxygen that allows combustion to happen even in the absence of air. This is why gunpowder can explode inside a sealed cannon barrel. It carries its own oxygen supply within the chemical itself. Charcoal is the fuel. It burns rapidly, releasing the energy that drives the explosion. Sulfur lowers the temperature at which the mixture ignites. Without it, the mixture requires far more heat to set off. With it, even a small spark is enough. The correct ratio took centuries to perfect. Modern black powder uses approximately 75 saltpeter, 15 charcoal, and 10 sulfur. Deviate significantly from those proportions, more charcoal, less saltpeter, and you have a substance that burns slowly instead of exploding. Shift too far in the other direction and the mixture becomes dangerously unstable. The difference between a controlled explosion that propels a cannonball and an uncontrolled explosion that kills everyone nearby is often a matter of a few percentage points in a recipe. Getting those ingredients was its own challenge. Saltpeter, the most critical component, does not exist in large pure deposits in nature. It forms naturally in soils rich in organic matter, particularly in places where large amounts of animal waste decompose over time. Stables. Dungeons. The floors of caves rich in bat droppings. In medieval Europe, governments employed men called saltpeter collectors, whose job was to scrape the white crystalline deposits from the walls of stables, latrines, and cellars. In France, these collectors had the legal right to enter any property and dig up the floors if they believed saltpeter might be present. Farmers hated them. Governments could not function without them. Charcoal was simpler to produce, would burn slowly in a low-oxygen environment, but the type of wood mattered. Willow, alder, and vine would produce the best results. Oak produced too much ash. Pine burned too fast. Sulfur was typically mined from volcanic regions. Sicily was one of the largest sources in Europe for centuries, giving the island a strategic importance that had nothing to do with its location and everything to do with what lay beneath its surface. Obtaining all three ingredients in sufficient quantities was a logistical challenge that shaped the foreign policy of nations for hundreds of years. The knowledge of gunpowder did not stay in China. It traveled west along the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. By the 13th century, Islamic scholars had documented the formula. Roger Bacon, an English friar, wrote about it in Europe in 1267, carefully disguising the formula in an anagram, apparently afraid of what would happen if the knowledge became widely available. He was right to be afraid. Within a century, the formula was circulating freely across Europe, and the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The first European cannons appeared in the early 14th century. They were crude, unreliable, and as dangerous to their operators as to their targets. Early cannon barrels were made of iron strips welded together like barrel staves and bound with iron rings. They frequently exploded. King James II of Scotland was killed in 1460 when the cannon standing beside him burst during a siege. But the failures did not stop the development. They accelerated it. Each explosion was analyzed. Each failure produced information. Metallurgists began casting cannon barrels from bronze, then from iron, producing weapons that could withstand the forces of repeated firing. Gunpowder formulas were refined. Grain size was adjusted, larger grains burned more slowly, producing the sustained push needed to propel a heavy cannonball, while smaller grains burned faster, better suited for small firearms. By the late 15th century, the cannon had already made the medieval castle obsolete. The stone walls that had protected European nobility for centuries, walls that could withstand years of conventional siege, crumbled within days under sustained cannon fire. In 1453, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II used massive bronze cannons to breach the walls of Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire that had survived for over 1,000 years. The walls had not changed. The weapons had. And with the walls went the entire military and political structure they had supported. The armored knight, a figure who had dominated European warfare for centuries, became irrelevant almost overnight. A mounted knight in full plate armor cost as much to equip as a small village. A musketeer with a firearm cost a fraction of that and could kill the knight from a distance that made his armor meaningless. Warfare democratized. Suddenly, a conscripted farmer with a few weeks of training could kill a professional warrior who had spent his entire life preparing for battle. The nobility of Europe had built their power on the assumption that military superiority was expensive and difficult to acquire. Gunpowder made that assumption obsolete. Here is the part of the gunpowder story that most history books skip. The weapon changed warfare. But the same technology, applied differently, changed almost everything else. Mining had been one of the most dangerous and labor-intensive industries in the ancient world. Extracting ore from deep underground required men to chip away at solid rock by hand, working in darkness, in heat, in air thick with dust, for hours to advance a tunnel by inches. In 1627, gunpowder was used for the first time in a European mine, in Banská Štiavnica in what is now Slovakia. The results were immediate. Explosive charges could fracture rock that would have taken weeks of manual labor to remove. Mines could go deeper. Tunnels could be driven through mountains. Within decades, gunpowder had transformed mining across Europe and eventually the world. The metals, coal, and minerals that powered the Industrial Revolution were accessed at the scale needed only because gunpowder made deep mining economically viable. Roads and canals followed. The construction of the Erie Canal in the early 19th century, which connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic and opened the American interior to trade, required blasting through miles of rock. Without gunpowder, it would have taken generations. With it, it took 8 years. The Transcontinental Railroad, the project that physically united the United States from coast to coast, was built in part by Chinese laborers who used their ancestors' invention to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains. The very people whose forebears had discovered gunpowder used it to build the infrastructure of the country that would become the most powerful nation on Earth. And then there were fireworks. The original use of gunpowder in China, before anyone thought to put it in a weapon, was celebration. The Chinese had discovered that gunpowder packed into bamboo tubes and thrown into a fire produced a loud crack that was believed to frighten away evil spirits. From that simple beginning came rockets, aerial shells, and eventually the modern fireworks display. Today, the global fireworks industry generates billions of dollars annually. Every New Year celebration, every national holiday, every Olympic opening ceremony that lights up the sky does so using a direct descendant of that accidental explosion in a Tang Dynasty laboratory. The alchemists were looking for a way to cheat death. What they created instead became the foundation of modern infrastructure, modern warfare, and modern celebration. I want to be honest about something that the standard history of gunpowder tends to minimize. The same technology that built roads and railways and lit up New Year's Eve also produced casualties on a scale that the ancient world could not have imagined. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916. In a single day, July 1st, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties. 19,240 men were killed. In one day. On one section of one front of one war. The artillery barrages that preceded that assault fired over 1.5 million shells in the week before the attack. The entire week of bombardment was so loud it could be heard across the English Channel in southern England. None of that was possible without gunpowder. The same chemical reaction that a Tang Dynasty alchemist accidentally discovered in 850 AD was still at the heart of every shell, every artillery piece, and every rifle cartridge fired at the Somme over 1,000 years later. The industrial scale of modern warfare, the capacity to kill tens of thousands of people in a single day, is a direct consequence of the refinement and mass production of gunpowder and its descendants. I am not suggesting the Chinese alchemists bear moral responsibility for the Somme. They had no way of knowing what they had set in motion. But I think it is important to hold both things in mind simultaneously. The same invention that made the Transcontinental Railroad possible also made industrialized mass death possible. That tension, between the constructive and destructive applications of the same technology, is not unique to gunpowder. It appears again and again throughout the history of human invention. And gunpowder is perhaps the clearest example of it that history offers. By the 19th century, gunpowder itself was beginning to be replaced. In 1884, a French chemist named Paul Weil developed smokeless powder, a propellant based on nitrocellulose rather than the traditional black powder formula. It was more powerful, more consistent, and produced far less smoke. The clouds of black smoke that had obscured battlefields for centuries, making it nearly impossible to see what was happening after the first volley, disappeared. Modern military propellants bear almost no chemical resemblance to the original Chinese formula. The muskets and cannons of the 17th century have given way to weapons that their creators could not have conceived. And yet the original formula, 75 saltpeter, 15 charcoal, 10 sulfur, is still in use today. In fireworks. In certain types of mining blasting. In the black powder cartridges used by historical firearms enthusiasts. In theatrical pyrotechnics. The formula that a Tang Dynasty alchemist stumbled upon while looking for immortality has now been in continuous use for over 1,100 years. No other chemical formula in human history has remained in practical use for longer. In 1996, 11 centuries after that first accidental explosion in a Chinese laboratory, a fireworks display lit up the sky above the Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. The chemical reaction that produced those colors was essentially identical to the one that burned down that Tang Dynasty laboratory in 850 AD. Same oxidizer. Same fuel. Same sulfur. Different world. The invention that those alchemists created by accident has now outlasted every empire, every dynasty, and every civilization that existed at the time of its discovery. The Tang Dynasty is gone. The Byzantine Empire is gone. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. Gunpowder remains. It built the borders of the modern world and destroyed millions of people in the process of doing so. It carved roads through mountains and tunnels under rivers. It lit up celebrations and obliterated cities. It made exploration possible and conquest inevitable. All of it traces back to three ingredients: saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, combined in the wrong proportions by someone who was trying to do something else entirely. The alchemists never found the Elixir of Immortality. But in a way, they found something close. They found a formula that would never be forgotten. A discovery so consequential that no civilization that encountered it could choose to ignore it. An invention that embedded itself permanently into the structure of human history. They were trying to live forever. What they created instead ensured that humanity would never forget them. If this changed how you think about something you have probably seen in fireworks and action movies your entire life, hit like. It genuinely helps ancient survival reach more people who want history told the way it actually happened. Subscribe for more deep dives into the inventions, discoveries, and decisions that built the world we live in. And I want to ask you something genuinely, not as a formula, but because I am actually curious. Where do you think the real turning point in the gunpowder story was? Was it the moment the Chinese alchemists first discovered it by accident? Was it when the Ottoman cannons brought down the walls of Constantinople? Was it when it moved from the battlefield into the mine and the construction site? Drop your answer in the comments. Because after researching this entire story, my own answer surprised me, and I want to see if yours matches.